Hi, everyone. Thank you. Welcome. So we got undergrads here. Yeah. Yeah. One undergrad. We got my grad class here. We got the grad fiction. We have the grad poetry. Where's the grad poetry? Was it? We blown it off. So I'm Saeed. I lead the creative nonfiction track. Last class of the semester today. How about that? Huh? Thank you. Let's do this right. So it's a pleasure to welcome Elif Batuman to our Hunter College Distinguished Writers Series. Thank you, Elif, for coming. She's a best-selling novelist, essayist, journalist, critic, winner of the Whiting Award, the Paris Review's Terry Southern Prize for Humor, among many others, which I will get to in a minute. But before I do, Elif's writing spans the globe as much as it does her subjects, whether she's writing about Edith Wharton, Russian writers, bison, Japan's rent-a-family industry, or what it's like to wear a headscarf in Turkey. Her writing is always funny, smart, self-deprecating. She's adept at finding big ideas in seemingly small moments. Let me give you an example. Here she is about going to Russia to attend an international Tolstoy conference. But first she has to make it onto the plane. Quote, on the day of my flight to Moscow, I was late to the airport. Check-in was already closed. Although I was eventually let onto the plane, my suitcase was not, and it subsequently vanished altogether. And here we get profound for a minute. Air travel is like death. Everything is taken from you. Elif is the author of 3 books, most recently the novel Either Or, which she'll be reading from tonight, and which we have for sale in the back. Mike, is that the only one we're selling tonight? Either Or? Yes. That's the only one we got. All right, here we go. So she'll be signing after reading. Publishers Weekly named it one of the top 10 works of fiction published this year. Her first novel, The Idiot, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and shortlisted for the Woman's Prize for fiction in the UK. The Possessed was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in criticism. She's been a staff writer at the New Yorker for 12 years and has a PhD in comparative literature from Stanford. And I think Elif sums it up best when she talks about the profound importance of reading and writing in the modern age. If I could start over, she writes, I would choose literature again. If the answers exist in the world or the universe, I still think that's where we're going to find them. I'm very honored to present to you Elif Batuman.
Thank you for that really generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. I am super excited to talk to you today. I'm going to start reading some parts of Either Or. I just did a reading that was 15 minutes where it was like, I read a little bit from the beginning and then a few passages about the main character's students' experiences with creative writing classes. So maybe I'll do that. We can all relate to. So I'm going to start, it's a campus novel. I'm going to start on page 5. So you didn't miss anything. She got back to campus and then checked her email. That's on pages 1 through 4. But Lana got to campus the day after me, though it felt like years. I had already slept the night in my new room, eaten breakfast and lunch in the cafeteria, and made numerous trips back and forth to the storage facility, having the same conversation over and over. How was your summer? How was your summer? How was Hungary? I was dissatisfied by the vagueness of my own answers. I still hadn't figured out the right angle. How was Hungary? Lakshmi asked at lunch with a conspiratorial sparkle. Did anything happen? Notwithstanding my strong feeling that a lot of things had happened, I answered the question truthfully in the sense that I knew Lakshmi intended it. Nothing had happened. Svetlana asked me the same question that evening when we met at her warehouse-like suite and sat on beanbag chairs under an Edward Hopper poster and talked about everything that had happened since the last time we had spoken, when I had been in a phone booth in the Hungarian village and Svetlana had been at her grandmother's house in Belgrade. I told her how I had finally called Ivan in Budapest, how he had showed up with a canoe and we had sat up all night in his parents' house. Did anything happen? She asked in a lazier, more amused voice than Lakshmi's, but meaning the same thing. Well, like that one thing didn't happen, I said. Oh, sit in, Svetlana said. When Ivan first told me about the summer program in Hungary, he said I should take my time to think about it because he didn't want to force me into anything. Svetlana said that if I agreed to go, Ivan was going to try to have sex with me. This was a possibility I had never previously considered. I daydreamed about Ivan all the time, imagining different conversations we might have, how he might look at me, touch my hair, kiss me. But I never thought about having sex. What I knew about having sex did not correspond to anything I wanted or felt. I had tried on multiple occasions to put in a tampon. Tampons were spoken of by older or more sophisticated girls as being somehow more liberated and feminist than maxi pads. I just put one in and forget about it. I felt troubled by the implication that a person was constantly thinking about their maxi pad. Nonetheless, every few months, I would give tampons another shot. It was always the same. No matter what direction I pushed the applicator, however methodically I tried all the different angles, the result was always the same, a blinding electric pain. I read and reread the instructions. Clearly, I was doing something wrong, but what? It was worrisome, especially since I was pretty sure that a guy, that Ivan, would be bigger than a tampon. But at that point, my brain stopped being able to entertain it. It became unthinkable. Svetlana said I had better think about it. You wouldn't want to end up in that situation and not have thought about it, she said, reasonably. And yet it turned out that there wasn't that much to think about. It was immediately obvious that if Ivan tried to have sex with me, I would let him. Maybe he would be able to tell me what I had been doing wrong, and it wouldn't be as terrible as trying to put in a tampon. Thank you. So that's the little part that I usually read. Okay. Every week in creative writing class, we read 2 short stories, one by an actual writer and another by one of us. The published stories were usually okay, but everything we wrote was awful. Why do we have to talk about it? All the suggestions felt random and performative. It was like we were all looking at the same malformed sweater and saying, maybe it would be better if it was a different color. Actually made out of ice. The most interesting part of the class was when the teacher, Leonard, talked about what it was like to be a writer. I had never met a professional writer before, apart from my parents' endocrinologist friend who wrote spy novels under a pseudonym. Leonard said that being a writer meant that you lived your life on the outside, looking in. Whenever Leonard went to people's houses, the men would be in the living room talking about football or the stock market. Leonard couldn't survive 5 minutes in there. He always ended up in the kitchen with the women. They were the ones talking about stuff he actually cared about, gossip, basically, about real or fictional people. Women were kind, so they never kicked him out, even though he had no kitchen skills beyond chopping things and opening jars. I, like all the girls and most of the boys in the class, smiled at this description and how the women tolerated Leonard despite his incompetence. But my smile felt a little mechanical. Why were the women always in the kitchen? And what was it that Leonard had forfeited by being with them? Why was he a writer and they weren't when they cared about the same things? Why wasn't he better at cooking? Why was there something exciting about the brutishness of the men who only talked about sports and money? You never know who has what it takes, Leonard said once. You'll be surprised later by who makes it. In Leonard's first year of grad school, one of his classmates had written a perfect short story about two guys in prison who trained fighting spiders. There had been no doubt in anyone's mind that he, the author of the story about the spiders, would be the one to become a famous writer. Yet, the next 3 years had gone by without that guy writing anything that good again, and he still hadn't written a book. In a lot of ways, being a writer was about endurance more than talent. Writers, Leonard said, were not normal people. As a writer, you were never totally present. You were always thinking of how you would put a thing into words. You were constantly putting yourself on the line and constantly being rejected. You betrayed the only people who really loved you. For this reason, the most honest advice anyone gave about being a writer, about becoming a writer, was that if you are capable of doing absolutely anything else, you should do that thing instead. I didn't get it. Wasn't everyone capable of doing something else? How is that a test of whether you should be a writer? From the way he talked, it was clear that Leonard considered himself to be a failure. Yet he had published 2 novels that could be found in bookstores, and he was teaching at Harvard. Why did he act as if those things didn't count? A cool dude called Marlin, who had sideburns, wrote a story about a cool dude called Marvin. We sat on different sofas and at some point drank some beer. Leonard said kindly, I think what we need to know about the story is whether, and I don't say this at all in a spirit of dismissiveness, but whether it's a story about not being able to get laid. Because if it is, that's fine. But we need to know that's what it is. Is that what my story was about? Leonard assigned us to read My First Use by Isaac Babin. All the surface markers, the type, the layout, the tone with which Leonard had mentioned it, indicated that it was a great and important story. The narrator, an intellectual, had been sent to join a Cossack military regiment. The Cossacks, it's a callback joke. A lot of Cossack humor. A Cossack soldier with long blonde hair and a wonderful face defaced the narrator's suitcase and started farting at him. Other Cossack soldiers also made fart jokes. The narrator tried to read a copy of the newspaper Pravda, but he was too distracted by the farting Cossacks, so he ordered the landlady to bring him something to eat. The landlady, whose farm had been requisitioned, looked at the narrator with dripping, half-blind eyes and said that she wanted to hang herself. The narrator responded by seizing and murdering a goose and ordering her to roast it. After that, the Cossacks called the narrator brother, and they all fell asleep together in a hayloft. There were many things I could relate to in the story. I had spent a lot of my formative years trying to concentrate on what I was reading while surrounded by blonde boys with amazing faces who were farting at me. But I did not see why the narrator had to murder a goose or be so rude to a disabled person. Was it because I knew that no matter how rude I was, and no matter how many geese I murdered, the respect and camaraderie of the tow-headed farters would always be turned against me, that I, my name, my appearance, my being, was part of what sustained that camaraderie? I knew that by having these negative feelings, I was being simple and simplistic, that the story was being more complex and thus more human than I was. The closing lines were about the narrator having nightmares that night. proof that the story wasn't endorsing his actions any more than it was judging them. Great literature didn't judge. It described complex individuals who were neither good nor bad. Oh, I knew how to get an A in English just as well as the next person. So then, in between that and the next creative writing class, this is kind of spoiler, but she has sex and it's like just as amazing as you would expect it's going to be from the like foreshadowing, you know, very like you might have heard of. All right. In creative writing, we read Chekhov's The Lady with the Little Dog. It was about a married man nearing 40 who had an affair at a summer resort with a married woman half his age. So she was my age. She went everywhere with a little dog. After they had sex for the first time, she cried and said that she had fallen and the evil one had tempted her. Then the man despised her and felt bored. In general, he looked down on women and thought of them as the lower race, even though he always needed to have one of them around and was always having affairs with them and then forgetting about them. At the end of the summer, the man went back to Moscow. At first, he enjoyed wearing a fur coat and going to parties. But time passed and he couldn't stop thinking about the lady with the little dog. That was how he thought of this person who was 19. Eventually, the man went to the crappy province where the lady lived, tracked her down to the depressing theater where she was attending an opening night, and realized that despite her ordinary, even vulgar clothes and accessories, she was, for him, the most important person in the world. When he cornered her during the intermission, she implored him to go away and told him that she had never been happy and never would be happy, but that she would come to him, Moscow. There was much I did not understand in this story. Did the man like having an affair with the lady? If so, why didn't he think she was special? If she wasn't special, why was he unable to forget her? I also felt confused by his attitude toward his children. The part where he was walking his daughter to school, explaining weather formations, all the while thinking of how he wanted to go to a hotel and have sex with his girlfriend, that was something I felt that I had always known. But the part where it said he was sick of his children, sick of the bank, lumping his children together with his job, that was somehow shocking. In class, everyone talked about how subtle and understated Chekhov was because he didn't idealize the characters and made it clear that the protagonist was a cad. They discussed whether it was a redemption that he was able to feel love for a woman who was banal and wore a gray dress. I wondered whether I was having a defensive response to the story because I hadn't acted the way the lady had when they had sex. I hadn't felt that the evil one had tempted me or that I had fallen, nor was I holding my breath for that guy to be redeemed by realizing he couldn't live without me. Someone said that the lady with the little dog broke all the rules of storytelling because there was no climax or resolution. Leonard said that maybe that was what was so wonderful about Chekhov, how he was in a wonderful way boring. Was that true? Did I agree? Fundamentally, I liked Leonard. It didn't feel like he secretly hated us or was trying to be mean. Yet almost everything he said caused me pain. Dan, any thoughts? Leonard asked. I didn't know how to ask what I wanted to know. Namely, what was wrong with Leonard and what had been wrong with Chekhov, and why they seemed so unhappy and made us unhappy too. Instead, I talked about my favorite line in the story, the one where the guy realized that all parties were the same. You were always just stuck in a room while drunk people said the same things over and over, as if you were sitting in a madhouse or a prison. Such a great description of what unrequited love feels like. Leonard agreed. I had never heard anyone say the word unrequited and hadn't realized it was pronounced that way, or that it was something Leonard had experienced, or not necessarily unrequited, but just not going the way you wanted to. gazing into the distance, Leonard talked about a wrongness underlying the machinery, and everything he said was true. Okay, I'm gonna stop there and then.
All right, just got a question. Awesome. Well, I'll throw out one. So, everyone was very responsive to the humor in your work, which people often talk about, which I enjoyed tremendously while I was reading it. So I'm wondering, do you feel that you just sort of find humor naturally in scenes, or do you find that you're building it in, or is there some sort of spectrum of how you deploy humor into the pieces?
I don't know, it's a hard thing to. It's really hard to. I find it hard to talk about humor. It's so important to me. My mom was very funny, and she still is very funny. Alive and well. And I remember her when I was growing up, like, she was a doctor, and she came here, like, she finished med school when she was 24, and she found herself in Jersey City, as a medical resident, and she still looked like a kid and kind of like was a kid. And as you can imagine, that was like a challenging experience for someone in the 70s. And she would often have stories that were about being sort of like lost or confused, but I don't know, the one that I'm remembering now is that every day at lunch, she made a point of going out and getting an ice cream cone because, like, she was in the ER, and she was like admitting people who had been like exploded by letter bombs. Just like, it just sounded really stressful. And then and she would get an ice cream cone, but she didn't like the cone, so she would throw it in the garbage. And then one day, one of the drunk guys who was sitting on the street, all of whom my mom knew because they were all her patients, one of them was like, "Hey doc, where are you nailing your ice cream cone every day?" And she realized that the thing she thought was a garbage can was like, I was hearing stories like that from an early age, and it was like, it's actually like, if you think about that happening to you, it could be kind of like scary or humiliating or stressful, but it's like, there's something about it being funny that just lets you sort of like coast above it, and it also sort of like creates solidarity, because like I feel like most people have thrown things in the wrong place at some point in some literal or metaphoric way. And I don't know, and humor does something like it isolates that. But I think the way that it works is often by pointing out that moment that you thought that you were alone because you hadn't heard it described, and that euphoria that you get of like, oh, someone else. So I feel like it has a lot of like kind of political potential. And I just find that I also find that humor is really present. Like, I don't know, there's a story about how when Kafka was reading, like he got his friends around and he read aloud. I forget if it was The Trial or Metaphor. He says, there's something you don't think of as being like a barrel of yucks, and like reading it out loud. And the people who were sitting there were like falling out of their seats. Like, I don't find that surprising, because it's like, there's so much wit in his writing. And I find that like a lot of even in, like biography or history or kind of like dry texts, I really appreciate humor. It's like a little gift, like a little gesture of pleasure. And it's like, I'm always trying to do it. And yeah, it's just like a register that I immediately want to go to, and I want other people to go to. That's longer.
It really is a gift.
Hi. Yeah, so we read Anna Karenina this year in class, but I remember reading that Tolstoy, one of the ways in which Tolstoy based Levin on him is that he had the same way that Tolstoy would often critique things would be to like feign ignorance or to feign confusion. And I noticed in both your novels that that happens a lot, but I was wondering if that's something that you were conscious of, or is that just something that you intentionally work into?
That's a great question. Like, one of my favorite stories about Anna Karenina is like, in the first draft, and the first draft is preserved, and it was, so it's a double novel, right? Like half of it is about Anna and Vronsky, and the other half is about Levin and Kitty. And he started with the Anna story, and he really wrote it as a commentary on this work about adultery, like novel, and everyone was talking about it like the buzzy adultery text, and he was like, I'm gonna write one, and it's gonna be about this like lusty woman who's full of life, but like you can't quite hate her because she's so, even though she's sort of despicable and is like having all this sex. And the first draft of it, or like, it wasn't called Out in Ukraine, it was called Molodets Baba, which is like, you go girl. Like it wasn't, didn't have that magic. And if you read the formalist critics about it, like, I can't remember if it's Eichenbaum, it's either Maurice Eichenbaum or Victor Shklovsky who says about it that the time, like the moment in the draft where it becomes like the book that we know and love is when Levin comes into the story. And there was something about putting himself into the book and having like, there's something about like inventing a person and being like, oh, I'm gonna invent a person who's like this. And then when you put yourself in it and actually like, how would I potentially, like there's a scene towards the end where Levin and Anna actually meet. It's only one scene and it's like all the way at the end. And it has this like electric feeling. And it's just like, but they're like a few degrees away. Like Levin is childhood friends with Anna's, what's the guy, like Anna's brother's sister, no, Anna's brother's brother. But like they look meet and they do eventually meet, but it's like there's something about putting them in that proximity and putting it in a world that Levin is looking at and is asking all these questions about that like makes it fly. That makes it. And I guess in these more in either or than in The Idiot, I was consciously trying to write a book with like certain political purpose, and it was I think like a lot of novels, actually, it was or a lot of novels that I find one potential of the novel that I found really exciting was the novel as sort of a machine to investigate why things are the way they are and whether they could be otherwise and how they could be otherwise. And for me, the advantage of writing a campus novel about someone who's like 19 and 20, even though I started writing the book when I was 40 and it, it was like 44 or whatever. No, I started it when I was 39. Really but like one advantage of people are like, oh, why do you do a coming of age? Like one advantage of writing about someone from that age is because you can kind of like get in there before the ideas have solidified, before the conventions have solidified, and like Céline is able to question things that I don't question anymore. And that was something that I really wanted to do. And you can do it, you can do it about your 45-year-old self too, because like those questions are actually there. Like if you can get there, but I feel like there's something about going back in time that made it easier to access. And that was really what I wanted to do, was like can't think of any way of saying this, and this is repeating exactly what I just said, but to question why things are the way that they are and how we like. So yeah, it was a
Hi, I'm worried you may have been asked this question a bunch, but I think it's really interesting. You and Andrew Sean Greer had these amazing 2017 novels and then wrote sequels. Like, why did you talk about it? And then why a sequel?
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about it at all. I have heard him talk about why he wrote a sequel. I mean, I think it's in a way it's related to autofiction, like his lessons are not exactly autofiction, but they're not exactly not autofiction either. And there's something about autofiction that really lends itself to sequels, because like, I don't know, it's like there's a character in Don Quixote who's a galley slave, and he's like in between like rowing in the galleys, he's writing the story of his life, and Don Quixote meets him, and he's like, so like, is your book finished? And he's like, well, how can it be, since like you can see I'm still alive? So it's like getting, oh, you learn new things, and it makes you, and then you write the book, and okay, well, I'm not going to generalize. For me, it was the decision to write a sequel was really a product of coming out with The Idiot and going on tour with it in 2017, and it's a book that's set in 1995 to 1996. and it came out a few, I was recording the audiobook like the week in early January, like the week before Trump's inauguration. And it was a time when there was a lot of questioning of the disease going on. Over the course of 2017, while I was on, doing book promotion and answering a lot of questions from readers and talking to media people and, really re-examining the book in a conscious way. Cause there's this process now, it's like, you almost think about the book more than when you're writing it and you actually manifest your physical body in front of people and so I was rethinking all those things at a time when in the country, in the US and around the world, there was a lot of revisitation of the 90s, and especially with Me Too, a lot of women were rethinking their romantic and sexual pasts, using terms like rape culture or patriarchy. Those were words that I don't know if I'm sure I knew about patriarchy. I don't know about rape culture. Quite likely I did, but they weren't concepts that seemed that applicable to my life, and suddenly they did in 2017. And I was also in a lesbian relationship after identifying as straight my whole adult life, and that being a really big part of my identity. And my personal life was going much more smoothly. And I was kind of why didn't I do this sooner? And so I was going back and replaying a lot of stuff and specifically thinking well, before I thought about it the way I thought about it now, how did I think about it? Because I didn't grow up under a rock. It's not like I didn't see examples of sexism. It's not like I didn't identify them as that. It's but I didn't have this particular way of thinking of it now. So a big part of writing the sequel for me was to restage and dramatize my encounters with, with the concept of being a lesbian, or with different feminist discourses. Sit-in hears from a friend about the idea of creature feminine, the French idea that language has patriarchy built into it, and so we have to discover a new language. And she reads about it and she's like, I don't want to, why do I have to write in a language that's devoid of logic and rationality just because a bunch of men were oppressive? Why do I have to write about waves and my period? I can write a universal book about universal things just like anything else. So it was about reimagining myself into that period. And as I was describing The Idiot and having conversations like this, I realized that a lot of these kind of political questions were already there in The Idiot, but that I hadn't really articulated them to myself. And they were sort of under the text, they were in the subtext, that there was a certain amount of depoliticization. There was sit-in. She finds out about government majors and she's like, well, why would I major in government? She doesn't really follow up on it. There's a part where she's walking with her best friend and they're in a gay pride parade in Paris, and it's so crowded with phallic floats that are spewing streamers, and they grab each other's hands so they don't get lost. And then when they get to a quiet street, Svetlana drops it in stand and says, well, I guess we don't need to flaunt the gay pride that we don't even actually have. And Finn was like, yeah. And why is that a sad moment? And so a sequel was sort of in a lot of ways, the sequel was to show what happened to Stan and Svetlana. It's the breakup of that, and the way that relationship was under siege from heteronormative romance that I loved, and to re-describe what it was that I loved, so that it's not just I was dumb. I really wanted to restage and re-experience and try to understand.
We have time for a couple more. Maybe someone over here.
Hi, I was wondering, you were describing both novels as campus novels, and but obviously I feel like people who are no longer in college and maybe on college age really enjoy the book as well. So was there anything that you were conscious of when you're writing about someone so young to make the book to make the book for people beyond the college experience? The story is contained in the college campus, but it doesn't feel young or like young adult. How do you achieve that level of, keeping the readers beyond college interested?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because like, yeah, some novels that are set on a campus somehow end up classified as or experienced as young adult novels, and some of them don't, and that might be due to all kinds of like extra literary features. I was thinking, I mean, I wrote the book, it's very much a book written from age 40, and I wrote it hoping that readers of different ages, because I mean, no matter what age you are, assuming you're at the age where you can like see novels, you remember being younger and you remember being embarrassed by things that you did when you were younger and making, you know, what now seems to you as mistakes. And I wanted to write it as kind of like almost like a machine to help the reader go back to their own younger self, whenever that was, and to replay those things that now look at like mistakes and to see like what was the reason for why did that look like a good idea at the time. And I don't know, I hope that it doesn't really matter what age you are to a certain extent. I don't know if this is, yes.
I'm not a writer, I'm an introvert here. But I am curious about the process that you use to construct a novel and how you start character development or an idea. And before you start writing, like, do you know where you're going? Do you know where you're starting, where you're finishing, and what the middle looks like? Or how does that work for you?
Well, I've only written 2 novels and it was kind of different for each one. And I know this is super different from person to person. Also, because the novels are both kind of based on my own experience, there weren't like a plot surprises. Like sometimes the question I get is like, well, why does it, you know, why can Satan just become a lesbian in college? Because I didn't. And it's like, it's not just because, you know, because I want to be faithful to my own particular experience. Like, it's not like I was able to memorialize the particular things that happened to me, which are not especially important. But because I feel like I wrote it sort of as a science experiment, like what happens if you take a person from this background and, you know, have did sports, and I was working backwards. I was like, the whole point of the book was to be like, why didn't I become a lesbian when I was in college? And it was like to you know, so I didn't really change a lot of things like that. With The Idiot, it was, I guess it sort of goes back to the campus novel question too. With The Idiot, the first draft was I had written when I was in my 20s, and I think that I was quite young and I really had written it to memorialize this very peculiar crush love experience that I had. And I'd written like I just thrown a lot of words at it. I was in grad school and I took a year off and I wrote nonstop the whole year, and then I kept writing for another few months and I took more and more time off, and then I broke my arm and I didn't have insurance, so I went back to school. And the book wasn't finished. And then I revisited it in my 30s, at which point I've been writing for the New Yorker for a while, and my job was writing, so I had a lot more of the facility to form. And I was like, oh, I see now what could make this a novel. It could be a campus novel. Like the 12-month structure would make this more, and that's the part that's actually. Because a lot of the book, when I read it at first, there was like a lot of distancing of my 23-year-old self from the 18-year-old self who started school. It was like, oh, you know, because I was ashamed. I was ashamed of the stuff that I did when I was 18. Already at 23, I was like, I was an idiot. I was like, oh, you know, we're young, we're so foolish, and you know, I just want to go out and shake that person, and then we get older and we get wiser and we understand. And when I was reading it in my 30s, I was like, no one wants to hear these like supposed insights of a like wise 23-year-old. The part that resonates is like the actual person who doesn't know yet what's considered right and wrong, who's just like acting and in the moment, and then it's having this like raw experience, and it was a matter of kind of like peeling away the rest of the stuff. So that's how that structure happened. With Either Or, because it had a more kind of like intentional, it was like the point of Either Or was to make the subtext of the Idiot into its own novel. And actually, at the time I was writing it, I had kind of like a crisis of faith in novels. So it was sort of modeled on Kierkegaard's Either Or, which is a book in two halves. And the first half is about how you should live your life in pursuit of beauty. You should live an aesthetic life. And the second half is how you should live a moral life, you should live a critical life, and they're like opposites and narrated by different people. So the first half of the book was going to be a novel set in the 90s, and the second half of the book was going to be an essay that in the time I was writing about how novels ruined my life. And then that structure started to feel sort of limiting, and it just felt like the second half was sort of like shutting down the first half and in kind of like a disrespectful way. And I was like, no, I have to like honor the novel part of the book enough to try to convey that skepticism within the form of the novel. That's going to be a more interesting book. So then I was stuck. I had this like sort of like a fake out half novel, and there was a like, how am I going to make that into an actual plausible self-sufficient novel? And the one weird trick. So like the hack that made that possible was reading screenwriting manuals, because there's like a huge amount of, because like conventional money, there's like a huge amount of literature about like, and a lot of like cognitive work has gone into like hacking what makes a person pay attention. So the book that I found really useful was Save the Cat, which really goes in, he's like, okay, your screenplay is 100 pages long on page 5, so then you can convert it to the 5% of the way through. And I use Scrivener, and you can see percentages and you map out the map and then reading time and all the stuff. But like, 5% of the way through, someone should like utter some kind of a challenge that's like actually the summary of the book, and then your main character should sort of question it, and then they have to like do something that's like a good deed on page 2 so that you like them and they have to save the cat from drowning, so that then they can be an asshole later, but you don't blame them so much because you saw them save the cat on page 2. And like it's all these little, and then and it builds in this 3-act structure to like the climax and the dark night of the soul. And I don't know if I would have been able to just like sit down and write a book that follows those beats, but I found it extremely exciting to think about, like, to look at what I had and to be like, well, within what I've written, what is the dark night of the soul? Like, what's the actual word? Like, what's the thing that seems like it's good, but it's actually bad? And what's the thing that seems bad and it's actually good? And then I wrote some new scenes to sort of like make it fit a little bit better. But then that was how I ended up turning it. I think.
Thank you so much. Books will be on sale in that. Will be so much. Thanks for